Peace that always died. The galaxy was very good at ending wars. It was terrible at ending the reasons for them. For thousands of cycles, interstellar conflict followed a pattern so consistent it became doctrine. Two powers would rise, borders would stretch, resources would thin, pride would swell. And eventually, inevitably, someone would calculate that the cost of aggression was acceptable. Fleets would mobilize, worlds would burn, treaties would follow, and for a time there would be peace. The archives of the Galactic Assembly were filled with those treaties. Encoded in crystal matrices and quantum vaults were declarations of unity, promises of non-aggression, frameworks for cooperation. Each document bore the signatures of species long extinct or absorbed into larger empires. Each one had been celebrated as the dawn of a new era. Each one failed, not immediately, not always, dramatically. Some lasted decades, a rare few endured for centuries, but eventually the equilibrium would fracture. A border incident here, a trade imbalance there, a perceived slight amplified by old grievances. What began as tension would become mobilization. What began as mobilization would become war. The galaxy had grown accustomed to this rhythm. War was not chaos, it was correction. When balance tilted too far, conflict reset it. Empires expanded until they overreached. They were pushed back until they stabilized. Peace existed only as the interval between recalculations, and recalculations always came. Alien strategists saw nothing unusual in this. They believed the system was functioning exactly as it should. Power must be tested, weakness must be exposed. Peace was not meant to be permanent, it was meant to be practical. If a treaty collapsed, it meant the original balance had been flawed. That was the logic. The problem was not war, the problem was expectation. Every empire assumed peace would fail eventually. They signed agreements while quietly preparing for betrayal. Fleets were never fully decommissioned. Weapons research never truly stopped. Intelligence networks never went dormant. Even during celebrations of unity, contingency plans were drafted in secret. This was not paranoia, it was experience, and experience repeated often enough becomes certainty. The galaxy had learned that peace was temporary, that cooperation was conditional, that trust was a resource too fragile to build upon. So when humanity began speaking about lasting peace, about structures designed not to enforce order but to sustain it, many alien leaders dismissed it as youthful idealism. Humans were new, humans were emotional. Humans did not yet understand the inevitability of collapse. What those leaders failed to realize was that humanity understood collapse better than most, because unlike the empires that rose and fell among the stars, humans had nearly destroyed themselves before they ever left their own world. And they had survived, not by perfecting war, but by learning how to endure peace. That difference would change everything. Control is not stability. To the great empires of the galaxy, peace was not a moral achievement, it was a mechanical outcome. When two civilizations reached parity in destruction, they called it balance. When one side grew dominant enough that resistance became irrational, they called it order. When fear suppressed rebellion long enough for trade to resume, they called it stability. And for a while, those definitions worked. Alien peace treaties were masterpieces of deterrence. They outlined territorial boundaries down to the last asteroid belt. They established resource quotas, fleet limitations, and retaliatory clauses calibrated to ensure mutual devastation if violated. They created elaborate arbitration systems, designed less to resolve disputes and more to delay open hostility. From a purely logical perspective, it was brilliant. War was expensive, peace preserved assets. Therefore, peace was preferable. But this version of peace carried a fatal flaw. It was built on control, not consent. Empires enforced order by suppressing dissent before it could coalesce. Populations were conditioned to equate obedience with survival. Leaders were elevated based on efficiency, not empathy. Decisions were made from centralized authority, optimized for outcome rather than impact. This created a surface calm. Beneath it, resentment accumulated. Entire species were absorbed into larger coalitions without meaningful representation. Cultural identities were flattened for the sake of cohesion. Minor grievances were dismissed as statistical noise. Individual suffering was considered irrelevant if the system remained stable. Alien governance measured success by compliance rates. Humanity would later measure it by legitimacy. That difference defined everything. When disputes arose under alien treaties, the response was immediate and procedural. Investigate, assign blame, impose penalty. The system corrected itself by reinforcing authority. No one asked whether the underlying tension had been resolved, only whether escalation had been temporarily contained. And so tension never truly disappeared. It calcified. Border systems remembered past occupations, trade partners remembered exploitative terms, generations inherited narratives of injustice that official records had erased. Empires did not crumble because they were weak. They fractured because they mistook silence for agreement. Control can suppress conflict. It cannot eliminate hostility. This was the pattern that repeated across the stars. A dominant empire enforced peace through strength. Over time, its power grew resented. Resistance formed, not always openly, not always violently, but persistently. Eventually, a triggering event would occur. An enforcement action misjudged, a resource seized too aggressively, a cultural symbol disrespected, and then the cycle would begin again. Alien leaders called this unfortunate but natural. Humanity called it predictable. The galaxy's greatest mistake was believing that because wars ended, peace had been achieved. In truth, they had only postponed collapse. Humanity would prove that real peace required something alien empires had never prioritized: understanding why conflict started in the first place. And to understand that, one had to remember what nearly destroyed them. We almost destroyed ourselves. Before humanity ever met another intelligent species, before our ships pierced the dark between stars, we had already perfected something the galaxy would later recognize: escalation. On a single, fragile world orbiting an ordinary star, humans waged wars that scarred continents. Entire nations rose and fell in cycles of fear and retaliation. Alliances formed out of necessity and shattered under suspicion. Technologies meant to improve life became instruments capable of extinguishing it. We learned how to destroy ourselves long before we learned how to explore. There were world wars, conflicts so vast they engulfed the planet. There were cold wars, periods where annihilation hovered silently over every decision. There were arms races in which humanity stockpiled weapons powerful enough to erase its own civilization many times over, and more than once we came terrifyingly close. A misinterpreted signal, a malfunctioning system, a leader unwilling to back down. Humanity stood on the edge of extinction not because we lacked intelligence, but because we misunderstood power. For generations, peace on Earth was enforced the same way alien empires enforced it, through deterrence. The logic was simple: if the cost of war was catastrophic enough, no rational actor would choose it. It worked, until it almost didn't. The flaw became clear over time. Deterrence prevented open conflict, but it did not reduce fear. It did not build trust. It did not dissolve hostility. It froze tension in place, preserving it like compressed fuel, waiting for ignition. Humanity realized something the galaxy had not. Peace built solely on the threat of destruction is indistinguishable from permanent anxiety. And permanent anxiety always finds a release. The turning point for humans did not come from victory. It came from exhaustion. Entire generations grew up under the shadow of possible annihilation. Children were taught what to do if the sky burned. Leaders made decisions knowing that a single miscalculation could end everything. The psychological weight became unbearable. We did not end war because we became morally superior. We ended it because we became terrified of ourselves. Human societies began experimenting with something alien empires had never considered essential: transparency between rivals, cultural exchange between former enemies, economic interdependence designed not just to benefit both sides, but to make war materially irrational. These systems were imperfect, they failed often, trust was broken, progress reversed. But over time, humanity learned that peace was not a static condition, it was a continuous process. It required maintenance, dialogue, shared narratives, and most importantly, memory. We remembered what escalation felt like, we remembered the brink. We remembered how easily certainty could justify catastrophe. That collective memory reshaped our institutions. It forced us to design safeguards not against external enemies, but against our own worst impulses. By the time humanity entered the galactic community, we had already survived our own near collapse. Alien empires saw our emotional history as instability. In reality, it was experience, and experience, earned through fear and failure, gave humanity something no empire possessed. We did not romanticize peace, we respected it, because we knew exactly how quickly it could vanish. Peace as maintenance, not victory. When humanity entered galactic politics, alien observers expected the usual progression. A young species would rise. It would test its strength. It would seek leverage. Eventually, it would demand territory, authority, or advantage. That was the pattern. Instead, humans did something profoundly irritating. They refused to treat peace as a trophy. To alien empires, peace was something you won. It was the outcome of dominance. Once an opponent accepted inferior status, stability followed naturally. Control was the guarantee. Hierarchy was the solution. Humans disagreed. They did not see peace as a moment of victory. They saw it as a system requiring constant upkeep. Like infrastructure, like climate, like trust, it could decay, and if neglected, it would collapse. This philosophical difference unsettled the galaxy more than any fleet maneuver ever could. Where alien powers drafted treaties focused on punishment for violations, humans drafted treaties focused on prevention of escalation. Where others invested heavily in deterrence, humans invested in communication networks. They created channels designed not for emergency response, but for early discomfort. The logic was simple. Most wars do not begin with aggression. They begin with misunderstanding, a misinterpreted military exercise, a trade embargo perceived as insult, a resource shift seen as preparation for invasion. Alien empires typically responded to such tensions by signaling strength, deploying fleets, activating defenses, issuing warnings. Humans responded by asking questions, not accusatory questions, clarifying ones. Why did you move your ships? What pressure are you responding to? What do you believe we are doing? This approach confused alien strategists. It appeared weak. It delayed decisive action. It risked revealing vulnerability. Yet over time, it produced something unprecedented: de-escalation before mobilization. Human systems were built to catch tension early. They encouraged transparency between rivals long before distrust hardened into hostility. Intelligence was shared preemptively rather than weaponized. Cultural exchanges were maintained even during disputes, preventing total narrative collapse. Most importantly, humans normalized accountability. If a human corporation violated trade agreements, it faced consequences openly. If a human fleet miscalculated near disputed space, it withdrew and compensated immediately. There were no secret exemptions, no special clauses shielding humanity from its own rules. Alien leaders watched this carefully. For the first time, they saw a power willing to limit itself, not as a tactic, but as a principle. This created legitimacy, and legitimacy is something fear can never achieve. The galaxy slowly began to realize that humanity's strength was not in how decisively it could end conflict, but in how persistently it could prevent it. Peace was not a declaration. It was maintenance. It required systems designed to assume failure. It required leaders willing to admit error. It required constant dialogue, even when inconvenient. Alien empires had mastered war because they assumed someone would eventually betray the agreement. Humans mastered peace because they assumed someone eventually would. And instead of preparing to punish betrayal with annihilation, they prepared to intercept it with understanding. That was the difference. And it would soon be tested. The first major test. Every peace treaty faces a moment that reveals what it truly is. For the Galactic Accord, that moment arrived sooner than anyone expected. It began in a quiet system on the edge of two rival territories, an unremarkable cluster of resource-rich asteroids orbiting a dim star. For decades, both sides had operated mining outposts there under strict treaty oversight. Boundaries were defined, extraction limits were agreed upon, monitoring satellites ensured compliance. On paper, it was stable. Then a routine supply convoy failed to arrive. Communications went silent. Surveillance feeds flickered and cut out. Within hours, each side accused the other of sabotage. Within days, defensive fleets mobilized toward the system. The galaxy held its breath. This was how it always started: a disruption, an accusation, a mobilization framed as precautionary. Alien leaders waited for humanity to react like any other power would. They expected ultimatums, they expected threats, they expected humanity to prove that guardianship was simply dominance wearing a different face. Instead, human guardians deployed a single task force, not to seize the system, but to position themselves directly between the approaching fleets. Weapons remained powered down, transponders remained fully visible, open channels broadcast continuously. Simultaneously, human investigative teams accessed both sides' data streams publicly. Every transmission, every sensor log, every anomaly was shared in real time with both rival powers. There were no private briefings, no selective leaks. What they found was embarrassingly simple. The convoy had not been attacked. A cascading systems failure in the monitoring network, triggered by simultaneous, poorly coordinated upgrades from both sides, had created blind spots. Each faction, acting independently, interpreted the blackout as hostile interference. Their mobilizations were not aggression, but fear. In previous eras, this revelation would not have mattered. Once fleets moved, pride demanded follow-through. Leaders could not appear weak by standing down. Humanity anticipated that. Before presenting their findings, they addressed the deeper issue, not the blackout, but the narrative forming around it. Publicly, they reframed the event as a shared technical miscalculation rather than a hostile act. They acknowledged how easily suspicion arises in systems built on historical distrust. They did not assign blame, they assigned responsibility. Both factions were required to suspend further mobilization. Both were required to submit infrastructure upgrades to joint oversight moving forward. And both were required to address their populations directly, explaining the error and committing to transparency. There were no military strikes, no punitive sanctions designed to humiliate, no demonstration of dominance, only clarity. The fleet slowed, then stopped. Within days, tensions dissolved, not because one side was defeated, but because neither had been allowed to construct a justification for escalation. The galaxy watched in stunned silence. The treaty had faced a crisis that would have ignited war under any previous regime. And it held, not because humanity was stronger, but because humanity refused to let misunderstanding mature into hostility. That was the moment many alien leaders began to understand something unsettling. Humans were not guarding peace by threatening violence. They were guarding it by denying conflict the oxygen it required. And that made them more dangerous to war than any fleet ever could be. Restraint over dominance. After the crisis in the asteroid system, something subtle but irreversible shifted. It wasn't fear, it wasn't admiration, it was recognition. Alien civilizations had just witnessed something unprecedented, a power capable of escalating and choosing not to. A guardian with legal authority to seize control of a disputed zone and declining to do so. A species strong enough to exploit instability and instead stabilizing it. In the aftermath, many empires conducted quiet internal reviews. They examined human fleet composition, they analyzed intervention patterns, they scrutinized decision timelines. The conclusion was uncomfortable. Humanity had multiple opportunities to expand its influence and consistently refused them. No forward bases were established in the disputed system. No permanent oversight installations were imposed. Once stability was restored, human task forces withdrew to neutral space. Monitoring responsibilities were handed back to joint committees. Alien strategists struggled to categorize this behavior. Historically, power accumulated wherever enforcement occurred. Authority expanded naturally through necessity. Every empire justified growth as temporary oversight that became permanent governance. Humans broke that pattern. They defined guardianship as temporary by design. Even more unsettling was their willingness to apply the treaty to themselves. When a human trade consortium was discovered skirting environmental clauses in a neutral sector, the response was swift and public. The consortium was penalized, its licenses suspended, reparations issued, no diplomatic shielding, no quiet settlement. The message was unmistakable, the rules were universal. And that universality built something alien empires had never successfully engineered: trust without intimidation. Trust did not mean blind loyalty. Alien leaders remained cautious, they still questioned human motives. But a pattern had emerged, one too consistent to ignore. Humans intervened early, humans withdrew once stable, humans punished violations evenly, humans limited their own authority. The galaxy began to understand the paradox. Humanity feared power more than it feared losing it. This fear did not make them weak, it made them predictable in the most important way possible. They would not exploit crisis for gain. They would not convert guardianship into empire. They would not tolerate injustice, even when committed by their own. And in a galaxy shaped by cycles of dominance and collapse, that predictability was revolutionary. Alien civilizations did not trust humans because they were flawless. They trusted them because they were self-restraining, because every action reinforced the same principle. Peace was not a ladder to climb, but a balance to protect. That realization did more than strengthen the treaty. It changed how power itself was perceived. For the first time, authority was associated not with control, but with accountability. And that was something no empire had ever offered before. The first generation. Without war. The first real sign that something had changed did not come from a battlefield. It came from silence. Entire sectors that once cycled through conflict every few decades remained quiet. Trade lanes that had required constant military escort became routine transit corridors. Border systems that had been flashpoints for generations began to resemble something almost unrecognizable to older species. Stability. At first, no one believed it would last. Alien civilizations had lived too long under the assumption that war was inevitable. Even as years passed without major conflict, contingency plans remained in place. Fleet exercises continued. Intelligence networks monitored for the smallest sign of destabilization. But something different was happening. Conflicts still arose, of course they did. Disputes over resources, political disagreements, cultural friction. Yet these tensions rarely escalated beyond negotiation. The mechanisms embedded within the treaty, transparency, early intervention, shared oversight, activated before mobilization could harden into aggression. Human guardians did not need to intervene as frequently anymore. The system had begun regulating itself. Generations were born who had never witnessed a total interstellar war. For many species, this was unprecedented. Young diplomats grew up studying negotiation strategies instead of military campaigns. Economies adapted to predictability. Infrastructure expanded with the expectation that it would not be reduced to debris within a lifetime. Cultural memory began to shift. Where once heroic myths glorified conquest, new narratives celebrated preservation. Leaders earned prestige not by defeating rivals, but by maintaining stable alliances. Even rival powers discovered that cooperation offered more long-term advantage than brinkmanship ever had. The psychological impact was profound. When populations no longer lived under constant anticipation of war, their priorities changed. Education systems emphasized collaboration. Scientific exchange accelerated. Exploration resumed, not as territorial competition, but as shared curiosity. The galaxy began to experience something it had rarely allowed itself: continuity. This did not mean humanity had solved conflict forever. There were still dangerous actors. There were still factions that resented restraint and longed for dominance. But the difference was structural. Escalation no longer found easy pathways. The treaty's strength was not in suppressing ambition, but in redirecting it. Species competed through innovation, cultural influence, and economic growth, rather than fleet expansion. Prestige was measured in reliability. Trust became a strategic asset. And humanity remained present, not omnipresent, not oppressive, but steady. They intervened when necessary. They withdrew when possible. They maintained vigilance not because war was imminent, but because complacency had destroyed peace before. For the first time in galactic history, peace endured long enough to reshape expectations. And expectations, once transformed, are difficult to reverse. The galaxy was no longer asking whether war would return. It was asking how to prevent it from ever feeling inevitable again. Why humanity learned the hard way. In the end, the galaxy did not remember humanity as conquerors. It remembered them as survivors. Alien empires had sought perfection in their systems, absolute authority, flawless deterrence, unshakable hierarchy. They believed that if control was strong enough, peace would follow naturally. And when peace failed, they strengthened control. Humanity took the opposite path. We failed first. We nearly erased ourselves with certainty. We trusted escalation. We believed power alone could secure stability. And when we stood on the edge of extinction, staring at skies we had poisoned and arsenals we had built, we realized something the galaxy had not yet learned. Peace does not survive through dominance. It survives through memory. Memory of what happens when pride overrides restraint. Memory of how fragile civilization truly is. Memory of how easily fear justifies destruction. That memory shaped every system humanity later built among the stars. We did not enter the galaxy believing we were wiser. We entered knowing we were capable of catastrophe. That awareness made us careful. And in a universe accustomed to power without reflection, careful was revolutionary. Alien civilizations trusted humanity not because we were stronger, nor because we were morally superior. They trusted us because we understood how easily peace collapses, and because we built safeguards against ourselves as diligently as we built them against others. Guardianship was never about standing above the galaxy. It was about standing between it and its own worst instincts. And so when historians look back on the era when the Galactic Peace Treaty endured, when wars slowed, when trust replaced fear as the default posture between civilizations, they will not call it the age of human dominance. They will call it the moment the cycle broke, not through conquest, not through annihilation, but through a species that learned the hard way and refused to let anyone else repeat the lesson, because humanity did not master peace by being flawless. We mastered it by surviving our failures. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to HFY Aliens Battle for more epic sci-fi tales where humanity proves that our greatest strength is not how we fight, but how we choose not to.